The most important naval decision of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not made by an American admiral. It was made at 9:11 in the morning on October 25, 1944, by a Japanese admiral named Takeo Kurita, standing on the bridge of the largest warship ever built, looking at a tactical situation that by every measurable parameter was developing in his favor, and ordering his fleet to turn around and go home. That decision, Kurita's withdrawal from the San Bernardino Strait approaches, preserved the Leyte Gulf invasion, protected 100,000 American soldiers ashore and hundreds of transport ships at the beachhead, and effectively ended Japan's last serious attempt to contest American dominance of the Philippine Sea. Historians have been arguing about why Kurita withdrew for 80 years. They argue about his communications failures, his fuel state, his physical and psychological exhaustion after 2 days of air attacks, his uncertainty about what forces might be operating beyond his visual range. All of those factors are real, but the operational data points to a contributing element that the debate often underweights, because the contributing element was a 2,100-ton destroyer that should have been dead within the first 20 minutes of the engagement and wasn't, and 2.5 hours of tactical chaos that a ship that size had no business creating. To understand why the Johnston's attack mattered strategically, you first have to understand what the strategic situation actually was on the morning of October 25, 1944, which requires understanding how thoroughly the American command structure had been deceived in the hours before the battle began. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, and it was also one of the most complex, involving multiple simultaneous Japanese thrusts and American responses across a geographic area spanning hundreds of miles. The Japanese plan, Operation Show 1, was built around a deliberate deception. A Japanese carrier force, deliberately stripped of its aircraft and operating as bait, was sent north to draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet away from the Leyte approaches. It worked. Halsey took the bait entirely. He moved north with his battleships and carriers to engage what he believed was the main Japanese carrier threat, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The Japanese center force, under Kurita, which had been tracked and attacked by American submarines and aircraft for 2 days as it approached through the Philippine Islands, emerged from the San Bernardino Strait in the early morning darkness of October 25th and found the approaches to Leyte Gulf defended by exactly one thing: Taffy 3. Task Unit 77.4.3 was not a combat force in any meaningful sense of the term. It was a support element consisting of 6 escort carriers, converted merchant hulls with a maximum speed of 17 knots, no armor, and aircraft loaded for ground support missions, not anti-ship warfare, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The destroyers were Fletcher-class ships, capable and well-armed by destroyer standards, but carrying 5-inch guns and torpedoes against a Japanese fleet whose battleships mounted guns up to 18 inches in caliber. The destroyer escorts were smaller still. The entire unit, by any calculation of combat power, was not equipped to fight what was approaching over the horizon at 6:45 in the morning. The escort carriers began launching aircraft and making smoke and running south at maximum speed. Their aircraft, armed with bombs and rockets designed for shore bombardment, made attack runs against Japanese warships that their weapons could not seriously damage, with pilots making dry runs when their ordnance was expended, just to force the Japanese ships to maneuver. The tactical situation was one of absolute material disparity, addressed by total operational aggression, because the alternative, allowing the Japanese fleet to close unimpeded, was not survivable for the carriers or the invasion force behind them. Evans made his decision at 6:58. He didn't request permission, didn't wait for a tactical directive, didn't calculate whether his action was consistent with standing doctrine. He pushed to flank speed and headed directly toward the Japanese fleet. The tactical rationale was straightforward, even though the execution was extraordinary. The Johnston's torpedoes, if she could close to effective range, offered the only weapon in Taffy 3's inventory that could genuinely damage or sink a Japanese heavy ship. Getting to effective torpedo range required surviving the approach under fire from weapons that outranged hers by a factor of 3 or 4. Smoke was the only mitigation available. Evans laid smoke and drove into it, and the Johnston emerged from her own smokescreen at a range that was inside the effective depression angle of the Japanese heavy-caliber guns and inside effective torpedo range simultaneously. She fired 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. The hit that blew off the Kumano's bow removed a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser from the engagement. That was the first material result of Evans's charge. Not a symbolic gesture, but a functional reduction in the Japanese surface combat power bearing down on the escort carriers. What followed for the next 2.5 hours was a running engagement in which the Johnston, subsequently joined by the other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 in coordinated attacks, imposed a tactical cost on the Japanese fleet that the raw weapon comparison between the opposing forces would never have predicted. The 5-inch guns that Evans fired at Japanese cruisers could not penetrate their armor, but they could sweep exposed decks, destroy rangefinders and fire control equipment, force evasive maneuvers that disrupted targeting solutions, and create casualties among the bridge and gunnery crews whose effectiveness was essential to accurate long-range fire. The torpedo attacks by the destroyer escorts, smaller ships, less well-armed than the Johnston, pressing to ranges inside 4,000 yards against heavy cruisers, forced the Japanese ships to maneuver violently and continuously. Ships maneuvering to avoid torpedoes are not maintaining the steady course and speed required for accurate gunnery. Every torpedo attack, whether it hit or missed, imposed a cost in targeting disruption that reduced the accuracy of Japanese fire against the escort carriers. This is the operational mechanism that connects the Johnston's charge to Kurita's withdrawal, and it is the mechanism that the romantic version of the story tends to obscure by framing the destroyer's attacks as heroic but ultimately futile sacrifice. They were not futile. They were doing something specific and measurable to the Japanese tactical situation. They were making the engagement expensive, confused, and uncertain. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Kurita's force had been under continuous air attack for 2 days, had lost 3 heavy cruisers to aircraft before the surface engagement began, had lost the Kumano's bow to Johnston's torpedoes, had expended significant ammunition in 2.5 hours of surface combat, and was operating in a tactical environment that was generating enough chaos, smoke screens, torpedo wakes, evasive maneuvering, continuous small caliber fire, that Kurita's force picture was significantly degraded. He was trying to manage a fleet engagement while simultaneously managing air attacks from Taffy 3's aircraft and processing conflicting and incomplete information about what else might be operating in the area. The communications failures that contributed to Kurita's uncertainty are documented and real. He was not in reliable contact with the other elements of the Japanese naval operation. He did not know that the carrier decoy to the north had successfully drawn Halsey away, and that there were no American heavy units between his fleet and the Leyte beachhead. He did not know that the support he had been promised from other Japanese naval forces was not materializing. What he knew was what he could see, and what his subordinates were reporting. And what they were reporting was a tactical situation that was more costly and more chaotic than the intelligence picture he had entered the engagement with. The Taffy 3 aircraft were not supposed to be able to damage his ships. Their ordnance was wrong for the mission, and yet they were making attack runs continuously, and his ships were maneuvering to avoid them. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were not supposed to survive contact with his cruisers and battleships, and yet they were still firing and still attacking at 9 o'clock in the morning. The operational psychology of Kurita's situation is under-examined in most accounts because it requires stepping inside a decision-making process that does not have a clean documentary record. But the inference available from the timing and content of his decisions is that by 9 o'clock on the morning of October 25th, he had lost confidence in his tactical picture. He did not know what he was fighting. He had been told the force opposing him was a support group with escort carriers, but the aircraft from those carriers had been attacking his ships for hours, with a persistence that suggested more resources than a support group should have had. The destroyers that were supposed to be driven off in the first 20 minutes were still attacking in the third hour. His force was damaged, and his fuel was limited, and he was receiving no reliable information about what American heavy forces might be approaching from other directions. At 9:11, he ordered the fleet to reassemble, and at 9:20, he he signaled his ships to come about. By 9:30, the Japanese center force was heading north, away from the Leyte beachhead. Within an hour, the most immediate threat to the Philippine invasion had dissolved. The escort carriers were still there, still launching aircraft, still making smoke, with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts that had spent the last 3 hours being systematically destroyed, still firing what guns they had left. The Johnston was sunk at 9:45, after Kurita had already turned away. The Johnston did not sink any Japanese battleships. She did not turn the tide of the engagement through raw combat power. What she did was something more precise and more important in the specific context of October 25, 1944. She extended the engagement. She forced the Japanese fleet to spend time and ammunition and attention on a target that refused to stop fighting. And she bought that time during the window when Kurita's operational picture was most uncertain and most vulnerable to the conclusion that pressing forward was too costly to sustain. 2 hours and 47 minutes between Evans's initial order to attack and the Johnston's loss at 9:45. Kurita turned at 9:11. The margin between those two numbers is the margin by which the Leyte Gulf invasion was preserved. Ernest Evans was 36 years old when he died in the water off Samar. He had spent his career preparing his crew for the worst tactical situation imaginable, drilling them in the procedures that kept the Johnston fighting for nearly 3 hours after she had absorbed damage that should have ended the engagement in the first 30 minutes. The Medal of Honor citation that was awarded to him posthumously describes his actions in terms appropriate to the decoration's standards: valor, gallantry, conspicuous devotion to duty. Those descriptions are accurate. They are also insufficient, because they frame what Evans did as an act of character rather than an act of operational reasoning. It was both. The character produced the decision. The operational reasoning made the decision coherent rather than merely brave. Evans charged a Japanese battleship fleet with a destroyer because he had calculated that it was the only action available to him that offered any probability of protecting the mission he was responsible for. The calculation was correct. The Johnston's contribution to Kurita's decision to withdraw cannot be isolated and measured as a single variable. The engagement was too complex, and Kurita's decision too multi-causal for that kind of precision. But the operational timeline makes the contribution undeniable. The ship that was supposed to die in 20 minutes lasted 3 hours and helped produce a Japanese admiral's withdrawal that preserved an invasion. The math Evans did on his bridge at 6:58 in the morning turned out to be right. The cost of being right, for him and for 186 of his crew who did not survive, was everything they had.